Hello. This video is going to be talking about how non-Western countries are dealing with the aftermath of World War I. As you remember, in the Paris peace conferences, there was a big push, especially by Woodrow Wilson, to establish self-determination in all of these countries that had previously been colonies. What we're going to experience, though, is that many of these countries are going to be sort of disappointed by that idea of self-determination, and we're going to experience different reactions. In certain countries, we'll see major political revolutions. In Russia, of course, we'll see the transfer of a czarist regime that existed for hundreds of years to a communist dictatorship. In Mexico, you're also going to experience a major political revolution. In China as well, we'll experience a period of civil war in the early 20th century, and then a transfer to a communist government as well there in 1949. So in general, we're going to see that these revolutions in Russia, Mexico, and China are sort of attempting that idea of self-determination. But we'll see that it sort of breeds mixed results in the sense that we know, of course, in Russia there's going to be a major pushback against self-determination, especially in the Russian Civil War. In the early stages of the revolution, the White Guard will amass itself to try to stop the Bolsheviks. That's not successful. The Bolsheviks continue to rule. But of course, as we get further into the 20th century, we're going to experience a long period of Cold War, which of course is, again, a challenge to that self-determination. In Mexico as well, we'll see the U.S. intervenes in many periods of their revolutionary era. And then in China as well, you'll see, especially once we get towards the end of the Chinese Civil War, which ends in 1949, you're going to see that countries like the United States are going to take the side of the nationalists. And of course, as we know, the communists are going to win that struggle. And so this is also a test of self-determination in the sense that the United States doesn't really want these countries to get their own way. They ultimately want them to become capitalist in nature. All right, so a little bit of a review of the Russian Revolution. As you know, the Royal Romanov dynasty was unseated in 1917. They had been in power for hundreds of years up until this point. So this is a major, major transition of the type of power that governed over Russia. It's rare for us to have such a dramatic revolution like this actually be a success, right? So they set up a communist government led by Vladimir Lenin, who you see here and here, right? Basically, the communists that overthrow the Romanov dynasty believe that eventually workers should own their own means of production, and they should also own property collectively. And the idea was this would lead to collective prosperity and a just society. So communists actually believed that eventually there would be no need for government whatsoever. They could have a stateless society that would live harmoniously, and that would be order would be kept by the idea that there would be no major divide between any socioeconomic status. As we know, this does not actually pan out, right? Even though the communists end up taking over Russia, they do need to have a major leader, right? You're never going to have a stateless society in communist Russia. The Soviet government tries to do this by abolishing private trade. It starts distributing peasants' crops to feed urban workers, and it also takes ownership of the country's factories and heavy industries. When Lenin was vying for power during World War I, his promise to the people was peace, land, and bread. But as you probably know, the Russian society actually experienced sort of the opposite of that. Even though they got themselves out of World War I, they undergo their own civil war, so they don't have peace. Land is also something that will be subject to a test, because eventually we're going to see that communist overhaul is a little bit too dramatic, and Lenin's going to have to introduce some capitalism back into the economy with his new economic policy, the NEP. So the redistribution of land is not entirely successful. And then also with regard to bread, we know that during the Russian Civil War, as well as the 5-year plan that Stalin introduced, we're going to have millions of people actually starve to death. So this promise of bread is something that also is not going to pan out. Okay, again, peace is achieved in terms of World War I with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which is where the Russians enter into a separate peace with Germany. This land here in orange we see is all the land that Russia ended up ceding to Germany to enter into that separate peace. And so that gives Lenin initial popularity because he does get Russia out of World War I. But we're also going to see that there's going to be major pushback by certain people against the Soviet government's actions because eventually we're going to see that with this attempt to redistribute land, property, there's going to be a major pushback because peasants find themselves hoarding their food stocks. Factory workers and sailors start to go on strike. And so what we're going to experience is the attempt to establish a communist economy over these people is going to experience a lot of backlash. Industrial and agricultural production drops really sharply. And so Lenin, by 1921, feels like he is not successful ultimately in completely transitioning the economy into communism so quickly, right? They're not used to the state totally controlling all of their assets. And so what Lenin has to do in 1921 is introduce the new economic policy, or the NEP. And what this does is it introduces, again, some private trade. It allows farmers to sell their products on a small scale. And so basically the NEP gave the people some economic liberties, but it was still in very strict control when it came to political policies. And the NEP did enjoy some success. And so the lesson from the NEP shows us that ultimately transitioning so dramatically to a communist style economy was too much. The people were not used to the idea of the government totally taking control of their assets. And so the NEP kind of shows us that maybe a more gradual approach towards a state-owned society would be wise. But the NEP ends up ending once Lenin dies in 1924. And then under Stalin, we're going to see something very different, right? Stalin, again, very dramatically attempts to establish a very communist structured economy. And he introduces his the 5-year plan, which was basically a plan to try to catch the Soviet Union up with Western Europe in terms of industrial production as quickly as possible. So Stalin takes control of the Communist Party, or the Politburo, after Lenin dies, and he sets himself up as a dictator. He rules for over 30 years, and immediately when he establishes rule, he abandons Lenin's NEP, and he institutes the 5-year plan. So again, the 5-year plan was an attempt to transform the USSR into an industrial power. The goal was to get this country, which at this point was still largely agricultural, to catch up with the industrial nations of the West. One of the major ways in which the 5-year plan was supposed to do this was to collectivize agriculture. And so basically what this means was that farmland was taken from private owners and given to collectives to manage. So in theory, a collective, which was called a kolkhoz, was a group of peasants who freely joined together to farm a certain portion of land. But in reality, the peasants were forced by the state to work on a specific collective, and they were expected to follow detailed plans and to reach specific goals set by the government. So basically, this eliminates private land ownership, and it forces redistribution of land, livestock, and tools, and this enrages farmers. Basically, they're still expected to work the land, but they have no control over what exactly they're producing, and they also don't actually have any ownership of the stuff that they produce. So essentially everything that they make is immediately taken by the government, and the real priority of the government is to feed the industrial working class. And so basically farmers very quickly realize that this is happening. The government is seizing their food and sending it straight to the cities. And so farmers retaliate against collectivization by trying to take matters into their own hands, and they take their crops before the government can get their hands on them. They start burning them. They even kill their livestock. So basically what we see is that farmers are very opposed to the idea of collectivizing agriculture. They know that it prioritizes them much lower than industrial workers. But we do see that some farmers also make the decision to move to cities for a better life, because it becomes quite clear to them that Stalin cares much more about urban workers than rural farmers. So collectivization is something that is not, well, it has mixed results, I guess we could say. It's a huge failure in terms of what happens to the peasantry. Millions of peasants end up starving to death, especially in the Ukraine. Okay, so again, the idea is that the government is just taking the food from the producers and giving it to the industrial workers. And so the people that are actually responsible for being the breadbasket of the country don't actually get to eat the food, right? In terms of industrial production, it is more successful. We're going to see heavy industry grow tremendously in the 1930s. But one of the problems is that consumer goods are in short supply. So just because you're producing more doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is in the position where they can purchase these new goods that are being produced. In terms of the shift of the economic structure, you're also going to see many more factory jobs available. And the people that do survive the famines are going to find themselves more likely to get jobs in urban areas with industrial production and less likely to stay on farms. Another major effect of Stalin's policies is just in terms of the atrocities that are committed when he's ruling. We know that Stalin represents definitely a totalitarian dictatorship in the sense that any group or any individual that tries to oppose his policies is going to be severely challenged. This is manifested with the Great Purge, which is basically where Stalin will punish all of his political opponents. He either just straight up has them executed, or sometimes he'll send them off to labor camps in Siberia, but they often die there as well, or at the very least they are removed from society and no longer influence people against Stalin. As we know, of course, with the collectivization of agriculture, he's also just quite repressive, just because his policies lead to the deaths of millions of Soviet citizens. Stalin also works to control the way that people see him in the public by controlling the press. Censorship was quite common in the Soviet Union. And so basically, in terms of the news reporting within the Soviet Union, many of his atrocities went unreported. And so the idea of, we know about the Great Purges, we know about the deaths in the Ukraine, but he tried his best to keep those news stories censored from the general Soviet public, so they didn't really know how bad the system was. The starvation in the Ukraine was something that was much more well known in the West than it was within the actual country. What's interesting, though, is that even though the Westerners looked upon Stalin as someone who was corrupt, they also looked at the Soviet Union's economy as something mysterious and sort of intriguing, because as you know, in the 1930s, most Western countries were experiencing a severe economic depression. And the Soviet Union was relatively unscathed by the depression. Part of this is because their 5-year plans actually created new sources of employment in urban areas. Even though the farmers were struggling immensely, the industrial class basically had full employment. And so in a time when in countries like the United States, unemployment was reaching 25% and above, people did look at the Soviet Union and think, well, these people still have their jobs. So some people actually thought that maybe communism would be a viable solution to economic troubles. All right, so that's very interesting to realize that it was still something that was interesting and intriguing for some. In terms of Russian culture in the 1920s and 30s, we see that in the 1920s, when Lenin was still alive, it was a little bit easier to produce sort of a satirical commentary of society around them. And by the time Stalin takes power in the 1930s, we'll see an artistic and cultural representation that is a little bit more controlled. It's much more difficult by the 1930s to actually express any sort of opinion that challenges Stalin's regime. Okay, so in the 1920s, we do see a period of experimentation in Russian literature and the visual arts. One of the best examples of this is Ilya Ilf and Evgeny Petrov's The 12 Chairs. This is a satirical novel, and the 12 chairs are actually a symbol of the confiscation of private property that we start to see happening with the instillment of a communist government. But the fact that the authors of the 12 Chairs are actually openly able to comment on this seizure of property is something that we won't really see in the 1930s as much. And in addition to the fact that we do have some satirical commentary of Soviet society, we do also start to see some films that are a little bit more like propaganda, sort of celebrating the Russian Revolution and also celebrating the future of communism for the country. One of the most well-known sort of pro-Soviet filmmakers of this time period was Sergei Eisenstein, and he made silent films, and they were all about Russia, and many of them, again, were sort of propaganda in nature. He had lots of films that glorified the Russian Revolution, and so ultimately, Sergei Eisenstein shows us a way in which culture could actually be mass-produced and sort of convince the Soviet people that the future of the Soviet Union was great, that everything that the communist leadership was doing was meant to benefit the people, and the idea was it would quickly catch up with the West. So Sergei Eisenstein is a good example of culture and government sort of working together to try to sort of portray a certain message to the general population. In the 1930s, we are going to see the Soviet government promoting sort of more realistic representations of the sort of the glories of socialism. You're going to see that most paintings are realistic in nature. These two paintings here on the right give us a sense of that Soviet realism. The idea was they were all supposed to be uplifting. They were supposed to be showing the advantages of socialism. You see here, this one on the far right is by Fyodor Gladkov. It's called Cement. And basically this is a celebration of working in a cement factory. You see, the idea again is that a diverse array of people can get jobs from this new industry, right? One thing that's interesting is that in Soviet Russia, we actually see that there's a little bit, compared to some of the other totalitarian regimes you see in Europe in the 1930s, there's much more opportunity for women in Soviet Russia than there was in, say, Nazi Germany or fascist Italy. So the fact that there are women portrayed in this cement painting as well, and also that there's a woman portrayed here, gives you a clear sense that, that again, this propaganda is also used towards women to talk about how their position in this socialist economy is far better than it would be in a capitalist society where women were not regarded as highly in terms of their working capacity. You know what? Let's take a break here. We just finished with Russia. We'll talk about the Mexican Revolution and the revolutions in China in the next video. So stay tuned for that. Thanks.